The phone call I never saw coming shattered my peace like a lightning strike. Olivia, the woman who had walked out on me, was back. Her voice trembled as she said the words I had long waited to hear but never thought would come. "I'm sorry for everything." For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. The apology was unexpected, but I wasn't sure if I could ever forgive her. She had torn apart our family, left me to pick up the pieces, and yet here she was, asking for another chance. But some things, I had learned the hard way, can't be fixed so easily. David's world, once so carefully orchestrated, was slipping through his fingers like sand. Every day had once been marked by small, predictable moments, each one providing a rhythm to his life. He'd always believed in structure, a well-kept house, a thriving business, a happy family. These were the building blocks of his existence, the foundation upon which he had staked his future. His mornings started the same way, with the warmth of sunlight streaming through the kitchen window as he prepared coffee. His kids, Lily and Ethan, would come down the stairs, sleepy-eyed but eager to start the day. The smell of pancakes or scrambled eggs often filled the house, a sign of normalcy, of everything being just as it should be. He took comfort in this, in the certainty of it all. Every phone call, every meeting, every report was just another puzzle piece to fit into his neatly arranged life. His job was his pride, but it was never his passion. It had been Olivia who had once sparked his dreams of adventure. Together they had envisioned a life full of excitement. They were both ambitious, driven by success and the desire to build something solid, something that could withstand time. But as time wore on, something shifted. It was subtle at first, a mere flutter in the breeze that could easily be overlooked. Olivia, the woman he had once fallen in love with, the woman who had once been so in tune with him, had begun to drift. He couldn't pinpoint the exact moment it started, but he began to feel the difference, the coldness in her eyes, the lack of interest in their family routine, the way she no longer sought his touch when they were alone. She was changing, and David could feel it in his bones. It wasn't just the way she dressed, although he had noticed the more expensive outfits, the sleek designer pieces that replaced her casual, simple attire. It was in the way she spoke, the way she looked at him as though he were someone she no longer recognized. The woman who had once been the center of his universe now seemed as distant as a stranger. There were times, late at night, when he would stare at her across the dinner table, wondering what happened to the woman he married, wondering where the spark had gone. But he never asked. He wasn't the confrontational type. It wasn't his way to bring up uncomfortable truths. He believed in smoothing things over, in ignoring the cracks, convincing himself they would heal on their own. But they didn't heal. Instead, the cracks deepened until they could no longer be ignored. At first it was small things, the late nights out with friends, the sudden obsession with her appearance, the subtle withdrawal from the life they had once built. Olivia had always been ambitious, but now it seemed her ambition was no longer tied to their shared dreams. It was her ambition, her need to be seen, to be admired. David noticed her increasing reliance on social validation, the way she sought attention from the people around her. There was a distance that had formed between them, and he began to feel like an outsider in his own home. When he came home from work, tired and weary, Olivia wasn't there to greet him with a smile or a warm embrace. Instead, she was always on her phone, lost in the digital world she seemed to care more about than the one right in front of her. There was an emptiness that David couldn't ignore. It was in the hollow look in her eyes, the way she no longer looked up when he walked into a room, the way she no longer noticed the little things he did for her. He started to realize that she was no longer his partner. She had become someone else, someone who no longer needed him. It was as if the love they once shared had been replaced by a cold, unspoken indifference. Their home, once full of life and laughter, had grown quieter with each passing day. The dinners that once echoed with conversation were now silent affairs, with only the sound of clinking silverware breaking the stillness. The children were confused, too. Lily and Ethan, young as they were, could sense that something wasn't right. They had started asking questions David wasn't ready to answer. Why was Mommy always out? Why didn't she play with them anymore? Why didn't she come to their school events? David had tried to make excuses, telling them that Mommy was busy, or that she had to work late. But the truth, deep down, was much more painful. Olivia had already emotionally checked out of their marriage. She was no longer invested in the family, no longer invested in him. And David, with all his reluctance to face uncomfortable truths, had remained blind to it until the moment when reality finally shattered his carefully constructed world. One Sunday afternoon, after a long, tiring day of errands and trying to keep the kids entertained, David returned home, hoping for a quiet evening. The house was eerily still, far too quiet for his liking. He called out to Olivia, but there was no answer. The silence gnawed at him. It was unsettling, like a warning that something was terribly wrong. He wandered through the house, his footsteps slow, deliberate, almost unwilling to confront whatever it was that lay ahead. The kids were upstairs, probably playing video games or reading, and David moved quietly through the rooms, his heart beginning to race as an uneasy feeling began to settle in his chest. When he reached their bedroom, the door was ajar. His mind, in its usual quiet way, tried to convince him it was nothing. Maybe she was just reorganizing, maybe packing a suitcase for a trip. But when he opened the door fully, his breath caught in his throat. There she was, Olivia, sorting through her things, her back to him. The sight of her doing something so ordinary, so mundane, was enough to send a shockwave through his entire body. It was like the ground had shifted beneath him, and the rug had been pulled from under his feet. The world around him seemed to blur as he stood frozen in the doorway. He couldn't process what he was seeing. He had always known something was off, but to see it in front of him, to witness the physical manifestation of her departure, was almost too much to bear. He took a step forward, his voice hoarse, as he asked, "What are you doing?" She didn't turn around immediately, as if giving him time to absorb the reality of the situation. When she finally faced him, there was no warmth in her eyes, no apology in her gaze, just an emptiness that spoke louder than any words could. "I'm leaving," she said simply. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, like she was announcing the weather or a change in her schedule. The words hit him like a cold slap to the face. He wanted to argue, to demand answers, to understand what had led to this. But the reality was too raw, too painful. There was nothing left to salvage. He had been blindsided, and there was no way to take back what had already been said. The days that followed were a blur of confusion, anger, and sorrow. The children didn't understand why their mother wasn't there anymore, why she wasn't picking them up from school, or why she wasn't there to tuck them into bed. David tried to shield them from the truth, tried to keep life as normal as possible, but it was clear that the damage had been done. The silence in the house grew louder with each passing day, and David felt the weight of the loss pressing down on him. The divorce came quickly, and while it wasn't as acrimonious as David had feared, it was no less devastating. Olivia moved on, throwing herself into her career, her friends, her new life. She no longer needed him. She had found a new world to inhabit, one where David no longer had a place. The children were left to navigate this new reality, and David had to find a way to hold it all together, even when his heart was breaking. Then came the phone call. It had been months since Olivia had left, months since she had cut ties with him completely. He had given up on ever hearing from her again. But there she was, her voice trembling through the phone line, apologizing for everything. But as David listened to her words, he realized that the apology wasn't enough. The damage had been done, the trust had been shattered, and no amount of words could ever fix the pain she had caused. In the end, David wasn't sure what he had hoped for. Maybe closure, maybe the chance to forgive her. But as he sat there, listening to her voice crack, he knew one thing for sure. Olivia had made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. David sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the untouched cup of coffee that had long since turned cold. The room, once filled with the sounds of laughter and comfort, felt heavy, as if the very walls were closing in on him. It had been 2 weeks since Olivia left, but the silence in the house felt like an eternity. His eyes lingered on the empty chair across from him, where she used to sit, and for a fleeting moment he could almost hear her voice again, teasing him about something trivial. The memories flooded his mind like a torrent he couldn't escape. He remembered when they first met, how it felt like the universe had aligned to bring them together. The way Olivia had looked at him, as if he was the only one in the room, the way her laugh had filled every empty corner of his soul. Those days felt so far away now, like another lifetime entirely, a lifetime he had lost. David's thoughts shifted to Lily and Ethan, their faces constantly popping into his mind. His children had been asking about Olivia every day, their innocent voices filled with confusion and pain. "Where's Mommy, Daddy?" Lily would ask, her small hand tugging at his sleeve. "Why doesn't she come home?" Ethan, always more quiet and reserved, had stopped asking, but his sadness was evident in the way he clung to David a little longer each night before bed. How could he explain to them why their mother had left, without shattering what little was left of their world? It wasn't just the kids he worried about. It was himself. The house felt cold without Olivia's presence, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had always been the protector, the one who kept everything together. But now, with her gone, he was losing control, and every attempt to hold on to the pieces of his life felt futile. Every step forward seemed to lead him into deeper, darker thoughts. The sudden sound of the phone ringing broke through the haze of his thoughts. He glanced at the caller ID, and his stomach dropped. It was Olivia's name, flashing across the screen. His heart thudded in his chest. He had promised himself he wouldn't pick up the phone if she called. He had convinced himself that it was better this way, that there was no need for any more conversations, that everything had already been said. But something inside him, some twisted curiosity, urged him to pick up. His fingers trembled slightly as he answered, his voice a low whisper of uncertainty. "David." Olivia's voice came through the line, distant and cold, like a shadow he couldn't quite grasp. "I need to talk to you." David's breath hitched. There was something in her tone, something wrong. It wasn't the voice of the woman he had once known. It wasn't the voice of the woman who had left him. It was softer, filled with a kind of desperation that made his stomach turn. And there was something else, an unsettling static in the background, like she wasn't even in her apartment. His gut twisted. "What is it?" he asked, his voice steadier than he felt. His hands clenched around the phone, the cold plastic digging into his palm. "It's about the kids," Olivia replied, her words shaky. I need to see them. I've been thinking about things, and I think it's time we talk about what's next." David's chest tightened. His first instinct was to say no, to tell her that she had made her choice, and there was no going back. But something stopped him. The kids. He had to protect them. They deserved to know the truth. They deserved to be loved by both parents, even if one of them had given up. But David had been the one to stay, hadn't he? He had been the one to make sure they were okay, even as everything around him crumbled. "You can't just waltz back into their lives like nothing happened," David said sharply, his voice colder than he intended. "You left. You didn't just walk away from me. You walked away from them, too." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. David could almost hear Olivia's breath, heavy with the weight of his words. But then her voice returned, quieter now, almost pleading. "David, please. I know I've made mistakes, but I need to see them. I can't keep living like this. I have to fix things. I need to fix this." David's grip on the phone tightened. His jaw clenched as a wave of anger surged through him. She wanted to fix things, after everything, after leaving him, after leaving their children. She wanted to come back and act like everything was fine. It was almost too much to bear. "No, Olivia," he said, his voice cold, controlled. "You don't get to come back and fix things just because you feel guilty. You made your choice. You don't get to have it both ways." Olivia's voice broke then. "Please, David, I'm begging you." David's patience was fraying. "I don't think you understand, Olivia," he said, his voice tightening with every word. "The damage is done. You don't get to pretend like nothing happened. The kids deserve better than that. They don't need a mother who's only half there." The line went quiet for a long moment, and David thought the conversation was over. But then Olivia spoke again, her voice barely a whisper, filled with something that sent a chill through David's bones. "I'm in danger, David." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Danger? What was she talking about? He sat up straighter in his chair, every nerve on high alert. His thoughts scrambled as his mind raced through possibilities. but none of them seemed to make sense. "What do you mean in danger?" David asked, his voice cracking, a knot forming in his stomach. He was fighting the urge to hang up, but he couldn't. He had to know what she meant. I don't know how to explain this." Olivia's voice trembled. "But something's happening. Something bad. I've been followed, David. I don't know who, but I've been getting these weird messages. And last night, someone was in my apartment. I don't know who it was, but I'm scared." David's heart skipped a beat. Someone had been following her. Someone had been in her apartment. His mind couldn't process it fast enough. This was new. This was real. Olivia, always so strong, now sounded like a broken shell of the person she had been. "You're telling me this now?" David asked, his voice low and dangerous. He wasn't sure if he was angry or scared, maybe both. "You've been keeping this from me, and now you want my help?" "I didn't want to drag you into it," Olivia responded, her voice desperate, pleading. "But I don't know who else to turn to. I think someone's trying to hurt me." David could feel panic creeping up his spine. Who was doing this, and why was she only telling him now? Could this be real? Could it be that she had been living in fear this whole time, hiding it from him? Or was this just another manipulation, another lie to pull him back into her world? "I don't know what to believe anymore, Olivia," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You left. You chose to leave. And now you want me to jump back into your life, when you've already torn everything apart." "David, please." Olivia's voice cracked. "I know I've made mistakes, but I need your help. I don't know what's happening. I'm scared. I'm so scared." David's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. On one hand, everything in him screamed to turn his back on her, to walk away and never look back. But on the other hand, he could hear the fear in her voice. The kind of fear that only comes when someone's life is in danger. His protective instincts, the ones that had always been there when they were together, began to stir. "I'll help you," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "But you have to be honest with me, Olivia. What's really going on? Who's doing this to you?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Olivia spoke again. Her voice was steady now, but there was a note of fear that still clung to every word. "I think it's him, David. The man I left." David's blood ran cold. His mind raced to catch up with her words. "What do you mean, him? You're talking about someone else?" "Yes," Olivia said quietly. "I think he's the one behind all of this. I don't know what he wants, but I'm scared. He's been following me. I've seen him around. I think he's dangerous." David could feel a cold sweat breaking out on his skin. His mind spun, trying to piece together the puzzle, but it was a blur. He had no idea who this man was or what he was capable of, but Olivia's words had struck him like a hammer. This was no longer just about their failed marriage. This was something far darker, something that could spiral out of control in ways he couldn't even imagine. "I'll come to you," David said, his voice tense. "We'll figure this out together. Just stay safe." As he hung up the phone, David felt a deep unease settle over him. This wasn't just about fixing their broken marriage anymore. This was about something far more dangerous, something that had the potential to destroy everything he had left. And as he sat there in the quiet, staring at the phone in his hand, David realized that he was no longer sure who the real enemy was. 4. Climax. 8,000 to 11,000 words. The moment of truth. David's heart raced as he stepped out of his car, the engine still running, the night air sharp against his skin. The streets of the city were eerily quiet, only the distant hum of traffic disturbing the stillness. He had barely processed what Olivia had told him on the phone. What he had heard was so shocking, so utterly impossible, that his mind refused to fully accept it. But now, as he stood at the entrance of her apartment complex, everything felt dangerously real. He had told himself he wasn't going to get involved again, that whatever had happened between them, it was over. She made her choice, and now it was too late for second chances. But now she was in danger, and whether he liked it or not, he still felt responsible for her. He still cared. His breath caught as he heard footsteps behind him. He turned, instincts kicking in, but it was just a man walking his dog, unaware of the storm that was brewing just a few feet away. David exhaled and adjusted his grip on the keys, his knuckles tight from the cold and from tension. Every step towards Olivia's apartment felt like 1,000 pounds dragging him down. But he had to do this. He had to make sure she was safe, no matter what had happened between them. The elevator ride was silent. His reflection in the metal doors stared back at him, pale, unsure. His mind replayed Olivia's words. I think it's him, the man I left. David couldn't understand. Who was this man? Why hadn't she told him about him sooner? Was this the person who had been following her, the one behind the strange phone calls, the one who had been in her apartment? And now she wanted his help? It didn't sit right with him, not one bit. But he couldn't ignore the fear in her voice. Something had shifted. Something had changed in the way she spoke. And David knew that whatever was coming next, it was going to change everything. The elevator dinged, and the doors slid open to the 4th floor. Olivia's apartment was at the end of the hallway. The door cracked just slightly as though waiting for him. He stepped out and approached it slowly, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. He raised his hand to knock, but hesitated, his pulse racing. He wasn't prepared for this. He wasn't prepared for what he might find on the other side of that door. With a deep breath, he knocked. There was a long pause before he heard Olivia's voice, muffled through the door. "David, is that you?" He let out a shaky breath. "Yeah, it's me. Open up." The door clicked open, and Olivia stood there, her eyes wide and desperate, her face pale as if she hadn't slept in days. She looked worse than he'd ever seen her, scared, fragile, like someone who had been pushed to the very edge. "What's going on, Olivia?" David's voice was tense, demanding answers. He was too close to this. He needed to understand everything. Olivia stepped aside, allowing him into the apartment. It felt cold, too quiet, as if the air had been drained of any warmth. The lights were dim, and the curtains were drawn tight, blocking out the world outside. It was like a cocoon, a place cut off from everything, but David didn't feel safe here. Not anymore. "I don't know where to begin," Olivia said, her voice trembling as she wrung her hands together. "David, I've been hiding something from you, something I should have told you a long time ago." David's jaw tightened, the weight of the words crashing over him. "What are you talking about? You've already told me a lot, Olivia. Too much." But I need you to be honest with me now. Who is he? Who's been following you?" She swallowed hard and took a step back, her eyes darting nervously toward the kitchen. There was a fleeting look of panic in her expression, as if she were afraid of what might be lurking behind the next corner. "It's not just him. There's more going on here, David. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to drag you into this." "Olivia," David snapped, his patience wearing thin. "I need to know what's going on, right now." She flinched at his tone, but her eyes never left the floor. "It's the man I left, David. His name's Derek. He's dangerous, and I think he's been planning something. He didn't just let me go when I left him. He's been watching me, following me, trying to get me back. And when I told him I wasn't coming back, he said he would make me regret it." David's gut twisted. He felt a cold chill run through him. The man she left, Derek, he was the one behind everything. He was the one who had been stalking Olivia, the one sending the strange messages, the one breaking into her apartment. David had been too consumed by his own pain to see it. But now, as the pieces fell into place, the truth hit him hard. "Where is he now?" David's voice was low, a simmering anger bubbling beneath the surface. Olivia shook her head. "I don't know. I don't know where he is, but he's here. He's close. I can feel it." David's breath caught in his throat. That's when he noticed it, the faint sound of a door creaking open from behind him. It was so quiet, so subtle, but it was enough. It was enough to make David's blood run cold. He spun around, and there he was. Derek. Derek's figure appeared in the shadowed hallway, tall and imposing, his face twisted into a sick grin. His eyes locked onto David, cold and calculating. There was no warmth, no trace of humanity left in him. Just a man consumed by obsession, by rage, by something far darker than David could understand. "You shouldn't have come here, David," Derek said, his voice low, almost amused. He took a step forward, and David instinctively stepped back, positioning himself between Derek and Olivia. "Get out of here, Derek," David growled, his hands balling into fists. "This is between me and her. You have no right to be here." Derek laughed, a low, mocking sound that made David's blood boil. "Oh, I have every right, David. You think you're the only one who's been hurt? You think you're the only one who's suffered?" David's anger flared. "She's my wife, Derek. You don't get to come in here and threaten her." "Wife?" Derek's laugh was harsh. "She was never yours to begin with, David. You were just a place to land when she needed someone to pretend she was happy. I've always been the one who understood her. I'm the one who gets her. And you." Derek pointed at David, his finger like a dagger. "You were never a part of that." Before David could react, Olivia stepped forward, her face pale with fear. "Derek, please, this needs to stop. You're scaring me. I don't want you here. I just want to be left alone." But Derek's eyes never left David. He moved closer, a menacing presence that filled the room with a dark energy. "You think she'll ever be free of me? You think she'll choose you? I don't think you understand, David. I will make sure she regrets ever leaving me. And you," he smirked, "you're just a casualty in this game." David's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the depth of Derek's obsession. This wasn't just about Olivia leaving him. This was about control, about possession, about a man so twisted by his need to dominate that he would stop at nothing to have Olivia back, even if it meant destroying everyone around him. "I'm not afraid of you, Derek," David said, his voice filled with determination, his body tense, ready for anything. "You don't scare me." Derek's grin widened. "You should be." Before David could react, Derek lunged forward, a knife flashing in the dim light. Time seemed to slow as David's instincts kicked in. He moved without thinking, grabbing Olivia and pulling her behind him, just as Derek swung the blade. The sharp edge grazed David's arm, a searing pain that made him gasp. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not now. The sound of a struggle filled the room as David fought back with everything he had. The fear, the anger, the adrenaline, everything collided into a single moment of survival. The knife flashed again, but David was faster this time. He twisted Derek's arm, forcing the blade to the ground, and then in a moment of pure instinct, David did what he had to do. He shoved Derek hard, sending him crashing into the wall. Derek groaned, dazed, his grip on the knife loosening. But even as Derek collapsed to the floor, the fight was far from over, because in that instant, David realized something that would haunt him forever. This wasn't just about Olivia. It was about survival. It was about keeping what was left of his family safe. David's breath was ragged, each inhale sharp and uneven as the weight of what had just transpired hung heavily in the air. He stood over Derek, his pulse still racing from the brutal confrontation. The blood on his hands felt warm and sticky, a grim reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. Derek's body lay still on the cold floor, his once menacing presence reduced to a lifeless heap. The struggle had been fierce, but now silence filled the room, oppressive and all-encompassing. David's eyes remained fixed on Derek's form, but his mind was elsewhere. On Olivia, on the years of pain she had suffered at the hands of this man. Olivia, who had endured a silent battle, who had carried this weight alone, and who had only recently begun to find her strength again. David's thoughts spiraled, unsure if this moment of victory could truly bring the closure they both so desperately needed. He slowly turned to her. Olivia stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with disbelief, her face pale and etched with fear. Her lips quivered, and David could see the ghost of panic in her expression. Yet beneath the fear, there was something more, something that hadn't been there before, a flicker of hope, faint but undeniable, hope born from surviving the nightmare that had been Derek, hope that perhaps, just maybe, they could move forward now. He stepped toward her, his movements slow and deliberate, unsure if he was the one who needed to comfort her or if it was the other way around. As he approached, he placed a hand on her shoulder, a simple gesture, but one that he hoped conveyed everything he couldn't say with words. He was here. She was safe. And no matter what came next, they would face it together. "I'm sorry, Olivia," he murmured, his voice hoarse from the emotions that had built up inside him. "I should have seen this coming. I should have done more sooner." Olivia shook her head, her tears falling silently down her cheeks. Yet there was no anger in her eyes, only a deep, tired acceptance. "No, she whispered. "This isn't your fault. You couldn't have known. None of us could have. But we're safe now, and that's what matters." David let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Safe. The words seemed strange on his lips. How could they be safe after everything they'd endured? But for Olivia, for them both, it was the first glimpse of something they hadn't had in far too long. Peace. He reached for her hand, holding it tightly, a quiet promise between them. Together, they would rebuild. The distant sound of sirens began to pierce the silence, signaling the arrival of the authorities. David glanced toward the window, his thoughts racing. The nightmare was over, or so he hoped. Derek's reign of terror was done, but what about the aftermath? What about the damage it had done to Olivia, to their lives? They moved away from Derek's still form, both instinctively heading toward the couch, where they sat in the quiet aftermath of the chaos. The silence that enveloped them wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy with the weight of everything they had been through, everything that had been left unsaid. After a long pause, Olivia's voice broke the stillness, barely audible, but carrying with it an underlying uncertainty. "Do you think it's really over?" Her question hung in the air, fragile and full of doubt. David's gaze softened as he looked at her, his hand still holding hers. "I don't know, but we'll face whatever comes next together. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out." Olivia leaned into him, her head resting gently on his shoulder, and David could feel the tremor in her body as she clung to him. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. They had both been forever changed by the events that had transpired, but in that moment there was a flicker of understanding between them, a silent agreement that they were in this together. "I should have trusted you," Olivia murmured, her voice barely a whisper, the guilt in her tone palpable. "I should have told you about Derek from the start. I should have let you in." David gently brushed his fingers through her hair, trying to offer comfort, to reassure her that there was no blame between them. "Olivia, you were protecting yourself. I can't blame you for that. We both have our secrets, but we don't have to hide anymore. We're in this together now." And just as they began to find a moment of peace, the doorbell rang, shattering the fragile calm they had found. A knock followed, loud and insistent. David's hand instinctively went to his phone, his eyes catching the notifications from the police, texts about the investigation into Derek's past, his connections, and everything they had uncovered. The storm wasn't over. Not yet. When the police arrived, the entire atmosphere shifted. Their presence was commanding, their uniforms a stark reminder that what had just occurred wasn't something easily forgotten. Derek was apprehended without resistance, his expression one of disbelief, but also something darker, fear of facing the consequences of his actions, of finally realizing that his actions had irrevocably changed the course of everything. David watched, his heart heavy, as Derek was led away in handcuffs, his fate now sealed. This was the justice Olivia had longed for. This was the reckoning that had taken too long to come. But at last, it had arrived. In the hours that followed, David and Olivia were questioned by the authorities. They gave their statements, their voices steady despite the emotional toll the entire ordeal had taken on them. There were still questions left unanswered, still parts of the story that had yet to be revealed, but for the first time, they felt something approaching closure. Derek's connections were being exposed. The truth was finally coming to light. As the days passed, the heavy weight of fear that had plagued Olivia slowly began to lift. She moved out of the apartment where Derek's shadow had loomed, a place that had been tainted by his obsession. She found a new home for herself, for them both, a fresh start where the ghosts of the past could finally begin to fade. But the aftermath wasn't just about physical distance. It was the emotional toll that remained, the scars that wouldn't heal overnight. They both faced the challenge of rebuilding not just their lives, but their trust in each other, in the world around them. The fear still lingered. When the silence became too still, when a door creaked open unexpectedly, but with each passing day, they learned to face it together, drawing strength from the bond that had been forged in the fires of their shared experience. Through it all, David came to realize something vital, that the hardest moments often lead to the most profound revelations. That love, in all its complexity, in all its messiness, was something worth fighting for, and that no matter how dark the world seemed, no matter how much they had lost, they would always have each other. The lesson that would stay with him the longest was this: even in the darkest moments, we are never truly alone. We are stronger than we think, and capable of more than we could ever imagine. Though the immediate crisis had passed, the impact of everything they had been through would last. And for David and Olivia, the road ahead was uncertain. But one thing was clear: they would face it together, one step at a time. The aftermath of Derek's capture marked the beginning of an uncertain yet promising new chapter for Olivia and David. The world around them seemed to change with every passing day, slowly at first, like the hesitant, almost imperceptible light of dawn creeping over a previously dark horizon. It felt as though the weight of everything they had endured, their loss, their fear, and the endless struggles, was still there, pressing down on them, an invisible force that neither time nor distance could fully erase. There were moments when it felt as though all they had fought for had been in vain, that the threads of hope they had clung to were still too fragile to hold on to. But then there were those rare moments, brief and fleeting, of clarity, of quiet strength, that reassured them that they had made the right choices, even when the world around them seemed to be falling apart. It was in those moments that they both realized the hardest part of their journey was far from over, but that they were capable of carrying on. They had endured far too much to let it all unravel now. They had each other, and that was enough to give them the courage to keep moving forward, to face whatever came next, even if the path was still unclear. Olivia's journey, though marked by progress, was still one of constant battles. Sleepless nights, haunted by the echoes of Derek's threats, his cold voice still lingering in her mind, were an ever-present reality. The fear of him, his presence, and the control he had over her life had left scars deeper than she could have imagined. It was in those long, lonely hours that she realized how small he had made her feel, how insignificant and powerless. Yet, in those same moments of darkness, Olivia began to rediscover something vital within herself. The realization that she was not just surviving anymore. No, she was healing, slowly but surely. And healing, she came to understand, was the most profound kind of strength she could have ever hoped for. But healing wasn't a simple path, nor was it easy. It came with its own share of challenges, moments of self-doubt, and pain. Olivia often found herself questioning whether she was truly strong enough to move beyond the memories, the trauma, and the fear that Derek had instilled in her. But as days passed, she started to recognize the change within herself. She began to see that each day she woke up, each day she chose to face the world, was an act of bravery. She was no longer the victim she had once been. The power she thought she had lost forever was still there, waiting for her to embrace it. It was not immediate, but it was real, and it was hers to reclaim. David, too, was wrestling with his own inner demons. As much as he tried to be there for Olivia, to offer her support, he couldn't escape the guilt that gnawed at him. He couldn't help but replay the moments before Derek's capture, the moments when he felt, deep down, that he had failed her. The guilt of not recognizing the signs earlier, the guilt of not doing more to protect her, haunted him relentlessly. Could he have saved her from those years of suffering? Could he have done something sooner? Could he have protected her from Derek's control and manipulation? In the quiet moments of reflection, David often found himself battling these questions, struggling with the weight of his own perceived failure. It didn't matter how many people told him he had done everything he could, that no one could have known the full extent of Derek's cruelty. The voice of guilt remained, persistent and unforgiving, always asking the same question: could I have done more? But as he stood by Olivia, supporting her as she healed, David also came to a realization. There was no way to undo the past, no way to change what had happened. He couldn't rewrite their story. All he could do was be there for Olivia now, support her in every way possible, and help her rebuild the life that Derek had so violently tried to take away from her. It wasn't an easy road, and the guilt would likely linger for a long time, but David understood that healing wasn't just Olivia's journey. It was his, too. Together, they would find a way to move forward. Outside their small, safe bubble, however, the world was still reeling from the shockwaves of Derek's fall. The media frenzy, the intense public scrutiny, and the legal battles were only just beginning. Derek's influence had been far-reaching, his connections vast, and now, with his arrest, the truth about his actions was slowly coming to light. The revelations were staggering, each one more horrifying than the last, and it seemed as though every day there was a new twist in the story. The ripple effect of Derek's actions stretched far beyond their own lives, reaching into corners of society that they had never imagined. As the case unfolded, more victims began to come forward, each one with a heartbreaking story of their own. Derek's cruelty was not an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger, darker pattern that had gone unchecked for far too long. With every new story that surfaced, the web of lies Derek had woven grew more complex, and the extent of his manipulation and control became clearer. It was as though a veil had been lifted, and the world was finally seeing just how deeply the damage had gone. But with each new revelation came an unsettling question. How many more victims were out there, suffering in silence, too afraid to speak out? Derek's actions had been horrific, but they were not the only ones. How many more monsters were lurking in the shadows, operating undetected, preying on the vulnerable and the unsuspecting? The world had been shocked by Derek's crimes. But was this really the full extent of the horror? Or was it just the tip of the iceberg? David and Olivia's story, in many ways, had become one of the countless untold stories in a world filled with hidden pain. They had found each other amidst the darkness, fought together through the worst of times, and emerged stronger for it. But their journey was far from unique. As the truth about Derek continued to unfold, it became clear that there were so many others out there, struggling in silence, waiting for their own moment to be heard. And so, the ripple effect of Derek's actions extended beyond just their lives. It was a reflection of a much larger issue, one that had been ignored for far too long. Society was waking up to the truth that monsters could exist in plain sight, operating under the guise of power and influence, and that no one was truly safe from their reach. Conversations began to shift from shock and disbelief to anger and outrage. People were starting to demand answers, to ask the hard questions that had been ignored for so long. But the real question that everyone seemed to be grappling with was this: how much of this was an isolated incident, and how much of it was just the beginning? Derek had been caught, but what about the others? What about the ones still lurking in the shadows, still manipulating and controlling without anyone noticing? How many more victims were out there, just waiting for the truth to be revealed? No one had the answers, but what was becoming increasingly clear was that this wasn't just a rare, isolated case. It was part of a much larger, much darker problem. A problem that society could no longer afford to ignore. The world was starting to realize that Derek's downfall was just one piece of the puzzle. As more victims came forward, the pieces began to fit together, and it became clear that the problem was far more widespread than anyone had realized. For Olivia and David, the future was uncertain. The world around them was still in flux, and they knew that the fight for justice was far from over. But they also knew that they were no longer the same people they had been before. They had survived. They had faced the darkest parts of their lives and come out stronger on the other side. And together, they knew they could face whatever came next. But for the rest of the world, the question remained: what happens next? What does society do when the truth finally comes to light? How do we rebuild a world that has been built on lies and corruption? How do we hold the people in power accountable? And how do we protect those who are vulnerable? The truth, of course, was that no one had the answers. But the ripple effect of Derek's story was far-reaching, and it was up to all of us to decide what kind of world we wanted to live in. Would we continue to turn a blind eye, allowing monsters to operate unchecked? Or would we stand up, confront the darkness, and demand the justice that had so long been denied? In the end, Olivia and David's story wasn't just about their survival. It was about the survival of all those who had been silenced, who had been oppressed and controlled, and who had found the courage to break free. It was about the power of speaking out, of breaking the silence and of demanding change, no matter how hard or uncomfortable it might be. It was a reminder that the strongest people are often those who have been broken the most, and that even in the darkest times, there is always a way to rebuild. But perhaps the most profound question of all was this: what kind of world do we want to create? The world of silence and complacency, or a world that refuses to stay silent, that demands truth, justice, and accountability? The choice, ultimately, is ours.